Space itself was bending around him, and something in the dark did not want him to leave alive. Ashton felt the cold hit his mind first, a psychic blow aimed straight at his thoughts, trying to tear his will apart from the inside. Alarms screamed through his cockpit. A beam of sickly green light had just clipped his ship, and the engine beneath him was losing power fast. He was hundreds of miles from anyone who could help him. Whatever waited below, twisting space with a hunger that felt almost alive, had already killed trained soldiers before he ever arrived. And yet 3 years earlier, this same young man had been nothing more than a heartbroken teenager, vanishing from a girl's life without a single goodbye. To understand how a boy who once passed notes in a high school classroom ended up piloting a machine that bent the laws of physics, the story had to go back to the beginning. Back to the day he disappeared. It started with an ordinary fight. Selen Lin and the boy she loved had argued, the way young couples do, over something that felt enormous at 17, and would seem small years later. She cooled off after 2 days, and reached out to make peace. He never answered. Not that day, not the next, not ever again. His seat at school stayed empty. Teachers had no explanation. When Selen finally went looking for him herself, she found his house sold and his family gone, as if they had never lived there at all. Desperate, she begged her father to pull strings at the police station and check his records. The answer that came back emptied something out of her. No such person existed, not in any database, not on any list. For a girl who had never lost anything that mattered before, this was the first real wound of her life, and she carried it in silence for 3 years, certain the boy she loved was dead. What Selen could never have guessed was the truth. Her seatmate had not died, he had been taken. Deep inside a government facility hidden in the northern frontier of China, a boy barely out of his teens had been recruited into one of the most classified research programs in the country. His name was Ashton, and somewhere along the way, he had gained access to something no other person alive possessed, a vast store of knowledge left behind by a civilization far older and far more advanced than humanity, buried somewhere inside his own mind. He called it the Eternal Knowledge Vault. Even he did not fully understand its limits. But by studying it night after night, he built things that should have taken decades to invent. Within 3 years, using nothing but that hidden well of knowledge and his own exhausted hands, he designed a lithography machine precise to 1 nanometer, a breakthrough that instantly placed his country's chip technology at the top of the world. To the handful of scientists who knew his name, he was already a legend. To Selen, and everyone else who had known him in high school, he was a boy who vanished and never came back. When his research mission finally reached completion, Ashton learned that Selen was alive, well, and studying at Jingdu University. He also learned she believed he was dead and that she had spent 3 years grieving a boy who never actually died. Any of the deans lining up to offer him an honorary professorship would have handed him a title in an instant. He turned every one of them down. Instead, he enrolled as an ordinary freshman, choosing the slowest, humblest path back into her life, just so he could stand in front of her again and try to make things right. On the day he arrived, campus felt like a different world from the classified halls he had just left behind. At the freshman check-in desk for the School of Business, a girl was already drawing attention without trying. Selen sat calmly while new students stole glances at her, and one of her roommates, Mia, teased her about it, joking that this year's crop of freshmen would be lining up outside her door by nightfall. Selen brushed it off the way she always did. She had zero interest in dating. What she did not say out loud was the real reason. Some part of her was still holding a place open for a boy she believed had been dead for 3 years. Mia was the one who noticed the sadness pass over Selen's face whenever old memories surfaced, and it was Mia who gently pushed her to move on, calling it nothing more than a naive high school crush. She meant well. She had no way of knowing how close to the truth things actually were. Not far away, a new freshman walked through the gates of Jingdu University, carrying a single suitcase, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Ashton had faced classified research reviews without flinching, yet something about walking back into Selen's world unsettled him more than any laboratory ever had. Within minutes, Mia found him near the entrance, volunteering to guide him to check in, completely unaware she was talking to the boy her roommate had mourned for 3 years. When Ashton casually asked if she knew someone named Selen Lin, Mia lit up immediately, teasing him for already knowing who the campus queen was on his very first day. She had no idea she was standing next to the answer to a question that had haunted her friend since high school. That gap between what the viewer already knew and what the people around Ashton didn't would only grow wider from here. Mia mentioned, almost as a passing fact, that Selen had a story worth knowing. She was the top student in their department every single year except one. Second place, always. Ashton went quiet at that. In his memory, he was the one who used to beat her by a single point on every exam. He had barely processed that thought before his phone rang, pulling him into a conversation Mia could never have imagined, a professor on the other end of the line, addressing him not as a freshman, but as chief engineer, offering to make him an honorary professor on the spot if he ever changed his mind about attending as a student. Ashton politely declined and hung up, and Mia never suspected a thing. Later that day, one of Ashton's new roommates dropped a piece of gossip that hit him harder than anything so far. Word around campus was that Selen, the school's most admired girl, had spent 3 years unable to move on from an ex-boyfriend who had died in some kind of accident. Ashton froze. He had never dated Selen. He had barely worked up the courage to admit he liked her before he vanished. Somewhere in the space of 3 years of silence, in the eyes of an entire campus, he had become her dead boyfriend. He needed answers, and he had no way to get them without revealing exactly who he was. That night, fate did what neither of them had planned. Ashton's roommates decided to eat dinner at a barbecue restaurant near campus, choosing it simply because it was close. By pure coincidence, Selen and her roommates picked the very same street for the very same reason. When Selen scanned the room and caught a glimpse of a familiar face walking into a private room, her whole body went still. She told herself it had to be a stranger who merely looked like him. She checked room after room anyway, unable to stop herself, each empty search leaving her more crushed than the last. She never found him at the table. What she found instead was silence, disappointment, and a growing thirst to drown the ache. Selen began drinking, glass after glass, while her roommates grew increasingly worried. She had never been the type to lose control. That night, she did. Ashton learned what was happening only when a roommate mentioned, almost as a joke, that the untouchable campus queen was out there drinking like she didn't care what happened to her. Something in him would not let that go. The Selen he remembered from high school had never touched alcohol in her life. He stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor and walked straight into the main dining room. He found her exactly as described, flushed, unsteady, reaching for one more glass she did not need. He took it from her hand before it reached her lips and set it down. When Selen lifted her head and saw his face through the haze of everything she had drunk, she did not see a stranger who resembled someone she lost. She saw him. Tears spilled down her cheeks instantly, and she said his name like she still couldn't quite believe it, telling him she would never fight with him again if he would only stay. She wrapped her arms around him and held on the way a person holds on to something they were sure they would never touch again. Ashton lifted her into his arms and carried her out of the restaurant himself. The street outside was full of students, and within seconds, phones were out, recording a boy in a plain white shirt carrying the most talked-about girl on campus like she weighed nothing at all. Whispers spread before they had even reached the dormitory gate. Somewhere in that walk, half-conscious and clinging to him, Selen made him promise never to disappear again, and made him agree that whoever broke that promise first would be the one to blame. Ashton meant every word of the answer he gave her. What neither of them yet understood was how heavy that promise would become, once the full weight of who he truly was finally came into the light. By morning, Selen remembered almost nothing clearly, only fragments, a warm shoulder, a voice, telling her everything would be fine. Mia showed her the video without warning, holding out her phone with a mischievous grin, asking if she recognized the boy who had carried her home. The second the footage started playing, Selen's whole body went rigid. There was his voice, asking someone to make sure they got his good side. There was his face, the one she had memorized down to the smallest detail and never expected to see again. Tears came before she could stop them, and this time she didn't bother hiding it from Mia. She needed to know where he was staying, which dorm, which building, anything. She didn't wait for an answer. She threw on clothes and ran. Ashton was walking toward breakfast near the men's dormitory when he heard his name called out behind him, breathless and urgent. He turned and found Selen standing there, tears already dried on her face, simply staring at him like she was trying to convince herself he was real. 3 years had changed him. He stood taller now, and something behind his eyes had shifted, a kind of steadiness that hadn't been there in high school. But the way he carried himself, that same faintly serious, old soul manner she used to tease him about, was unmistakably him. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Selen finally broke the silence, her voice shaking with something between relief and fury, asking flatly if he was supposed to be dead. Ashton had spent 3 years rehearsing what he might say if this moment ever came. None of it felt adequate now. He apologized for leaving without a goodbye, for the years of silence, but he could offer no real explanation. The truth was buried under layers of national secrecy he could never share, not even with her. All he could tell her was that something urgent had come up at home 3 years ago, and that he hadn't known how to face her before he left. Selen's expression hardened. She told him plainly that she didn't need his apology, that whatever they had once been to each other, they were strangers now, and he could come and go from her life however he pleased. It cost her more to say than she let show. As she turned to walk away, Ashton called out one more thing, telling her that the promise they'd made was one he intended to keep. Selen didn't turn around. She only asked bitterly what exactly he thought they were to each other, and reminded him that for 3 years she had sent messages into silence and gotten nothing back. Then she walked off, leaving him standing there with nothing to do but watch her go and quietly resolve to prove, over time, that he meant what he said. Neither of them knew that resolve was about to be tested almost immediately. That same afternoon, a call came in from Professor Grant, Dean of Scientific Research at Jingdu University, and one of the very few people aware of exactly what Ashton had accomplished. A separate national project, the design of a next-generation aerospace fighter engine, had stalled after a decade of failed tests. Grant believed Ashton could solve it. Ashton didn't hesitate to say yes. Public service came first in his life, long before his own comfort, and certainly before military training drills he could complete blindfolded compared to the work waiting for him at the research base. He packed his bag that same morning, telling his roommates only that a family matter had come up. None of them questioned it much, though one of them did ask, half joking, whether Ashton had even told Selen he was leaving. His hands paused mid-fold over that question, because the honest answer was no, not yet. What Ashton didn't yet know was that leaving quietly, even for something as important as national defense, was about to look exactly like the disappearing act Selen feared most. Before he reached the airport, fate handed him a very different kind of trouble, the kind with cameras and hashtags instead of classified files. An elevator at the departure terminal filled up fast, and a small crowd of fans began shoving forward, clearing space for a celebrity named Jason, a man used to getting whatever he wanted the moment he wanted it. His assistant demanded that everyone already inside the elevator step out to make room. Ashton refused. He pointed out calmly that everyone waiting had somewhere to be, and that fame didn't buy anyone special treatment over strangers with their own schedules to keep. Jason's fans erupted, outraged that anyone would dare inconvenience their idol. Jason himself, sensing cameras nearby, played the gracious victim instead, smiling and waving off his own assistant, insisting everyone else could go ahead of him. It looked, for a moment, like the matter was settled. It was not. The instant Ashton was out of earshot, Jason's practiced smile turned calculating. He told his fans, with false reluctance, not to post anything about the incident online. He knew exactly what that instruction would actually do. Within the hour, Fan accounts had flooded social media with edited clips and outrage posts, demanding an apology from the stranger, who had supposedly disrespected their idol. Because Ashton's identity was buried under multiple layers of state secrecy, most of what people found about him online was blank, and that blankness only fed the fire. Rumors spread that he must have cheated his way into Jingdu University, since there was no trace of entrance exam scores or achievements anywhere. Within a single afternoon, a boy with almost no public footprint at all became the internet's newest villain, and none of the people typing furious comments had the slightest idea they were dragging the name of a man the country's National Security Bureau was sworn to protect. The moment his file was flagged, alarms went off in an office far removed from campus gossip. A director there, a man named Harris, exploded when he realized thousands of ordinary users were digging into records meant to be untouchable. He gave his team 10 minutes to erase every trace of Ashton from the internet, warning them that China could survive without him as director, but not without the scientist they were failing to protect. What Harris hadn't yet accounted for was that this wasn't a single hacker to intercept. It was an entire fan base, moving faster than any firewall could contain. Meanwhile, in her dorm room, Mia burst in, holding her phone out toward Selen, asking if the boy being torn apart online was her Ashton. Selen's stomach dropped. She read through the outrage, then did something that surprised even her, firing back publicly in his defense, arguing that no celebrity deserved special treatment over ordinary people trying to catch a flight. It cost her. Jason's fans quickly discovered she and Ashton had gone to the same high school and turned their anger toward her as well, flooding her account with hate. Watching her name get dragged through the same storm, Selen didn't back down, though the fear in her chest was real. She told herself it had nothing to do with lingering feelings. Anyone would have reacted the same way to blatant unfairness. Mia, watching her roommate defend a boy she claimed to be finished with, wasn't fooled for a second. At the airport, things briefly got worse before they got better. A group of Jason's fans cornered Ashton in the departure lounge and dumped a bottle of water over his head in front of security, hissing that he wanted attention, and now he'd gotten some. Ashton said nothing, simply drying himself off while checking his phone, and there, in the middle of the humiliation, he found a short message from Selen, asking if he was okay. Whatever anger he'd been holding on to melted instantly. She was being attacked because of him, and she was still worried about him first. He called her. She picked up fast, her voice tight with worry, asking about the fans, asking if they'd hurt him. Ashton told her to relax, to stay off the internet, to trust him to handle it. Selen's voice cracked as she admitted she didn't see how one person could fix something this big alone. She didn't yet know that the machinery working in Ashton's favor went far beyond anything a single college freshman could manage on his own. Behind the scenes, Director Harris's 10-minute deadline came and went in a blur of furious phone calls. The head of the National Academy of Sciences rang Harris directly, warning him that if Ashton's identity was exposed, there would be consequences that had nothing to do with dignity. Harris, in turn, summoned the head of the Cultural Development Department and gave them 30 minutes to appear in his office, threatening to walk into theirs personally if they didn't. Every trending post about Ashton was wiped within minutes. Every one of Jason's pending endorsements and projects was frozen in the same afternoon. His agency's financial records were seized before the sun went down. Jason, still gloating in a private airport lounge, had no idea any of this was happening until his own phone stopped working the way he expected it to. Calls unreturned, deals unraveling in real time. By the time officers approached him directly at the gate, flashing badges instead of autograph requests, the smugness on his face had already begun to crack. He was arrested before his flight ever left the ground, a fall as fast and public as the one he had tried to engineer against a stranger in an elevator. Ashton, for his part, felt no particular satisfaction watching it unfold. He simply boarded his flight to the Northern Research Facility, carrying with him a promise to come back before military training ended, and an unspoken vow that whatever secrets he had to keep from Selen, the safety of the people who defended him would never be one of them. That night, alone in a guest room at the research facility, Ashton pulled a secure phone from his bag, purely out of habit, then hesitated and picked up his personal one instead. A message from Selen sat waiting, just 2 words wishing him good night. He stared at it longer than he meant to, before typing back that he'd made it home safely and was catching up with someone. He hit send without thinking twice. Selen read that reply and felt her patience snap in half. She had spent the entire evening working up the nerve to text first, and now he was too busy chatting with someone else to send more than a few words back. She fired off a string of messages telling him not to worry about her, that they could take turns being ignored so it wouldn't feel too unfair, and that she was going to bed. Ashton reread the messages twice, completely lost as to what he'd done wrong. Sitting nearby, Director Wallace, the veteran engineer overseeing the propulsion project, caught the confusion on his face and asked if there was trouble with a girlfriend. When Ashton admitted he had no idea what had upset her, Wallace, grinning like a man remembering his own younger years, offered to coach him through it. The advice that followed was well-meaning and almost completely wrong. Wallace suggested calling her something playful, and Ashton, taking the suggestion at face value, sent Selen a message telling her to sleep tight and stay warm, calling her a little rascal. Selen's reaction landed somewhere between disbelief and fury. She typed back, demanding to know if 3 years apart had turned him into a caveman. Wallace, watching Ashton's blank expression, asked cheerfully whether the girl had gone happily off to sleep. Ashton told him yes, mostly because it was easier than explaining otherwise. Over the following days, their conversations kept swinging between frustration and quiet tenderness, the kind of back and forth that neither of them fully controlled. Selen would send a good morning message and then spend the whole day checking her phone every few minutes, pretending she wasn't waiting for a reply. Mia caught her at it more than once, teasing that her phone must be growing flowers with how often she checked it. One afternoon, Selen even posted a photo from military training, hoping Ashton might comment on it, and when hours passed without a word, she told herself she'd officially stopped caring, then checked her phone again 5 minutes later. Ashton, meanwhile, barely had time to breathe. His days stretched from early morning briefings to sessions that ran past midnight, refining the theoretical framework behind what the facility called drive force propulsion, a concept that would let a craft move by warping the space around it rather than pushing against it with thrust. Most of the senior researchers in the building were decades older than him, veterans who had spent their careers on conventional engines. When he first walked into the conference room, some of them assumed he'd wandered in by mistake. By the end of his first 6-hour briefing, that same room broke into applause, and skepticism turned into something closer to reverence. Still, every reply he sent Selen at night became a small island of calm in an otherwise punishing schedule. When she asked, half joking and half serious, why he'd disappeared for 3 years without a word, he told her gently that he couldn't explain it yet, and asked if that was something she could live with for now. She backed off the question, though not without one more jab about how undeserving he was of her patience. It was as close to forgiveness as either of them dared to name out loud. 10 days after his arrival, the facility reached a breaking point of a different kind. A model of the propulsion engine stood ready for its first ignition test, the culmination of theory Ashton had refined night after night, much of it drawn from knowledge buried deep in his mind that no other scientist alive could access. If the test worked, it would prove that an object could move through warped space itself, a leap in propulsion science the world had never achieved. Wallace offered him a day to rest before running it. Ashton declined. He wanted the test done now. They handed him the ignition switch, and for one heartbeat before pressing it, Ashton felt something close to nerves, a rare thing for him. He asked Wallace to do the honors instead, mostly out of habit, and Wallace refused, reminding him he was the one who'd designed the thing. Ashton pressed the button himself. The chamber roared to life. Electrical energy surged through the model, red warning lights pulsed along every wall, and a 100-pound iron ball dropped from above, meant to fall straight down under gravity. Instead, the moment it entered the warped field, it shot forward instead of down, slamming into a gate 100 meters away, as if gravity itself had briefly forgotten how to work. For a second, nobody in the room breathed. Then the facility erupted, grown men and women embracing each other, some in tears, shouting that drive force propulsion was real. Wallace, a man who had spent his entire career watching China's engine technology crawl forward, one small step at a time, felt his eyes go red with emotion he didn't bother hiding. Ashton bowed to the room, thanking everyone for their faith in him, and as he lowered his head, it felt heavier than it should have. His body swayed. He recognized the feeling immediately, the same warning his mind had been sending for days that he'd been ignoring in favor of one more calculation, one more session inside the vault of knowledge he carried. His last coherent thought before the room tilted sideways was a hope that whatever came next wouldn't take too long, because Selen would worry. He collapsed before Wallace could reach him, and the last sound he heard was Wallace shouting for someone to get him to the military hospital immediately. Above Jingdu University 3 days later, 4 fighter jets roared across the sky in tight formation, escorting a single transport aircraft through restricted airspace. Students on their break froze mid-conversation, phones half raised, before instructors screamed at them to put their devices away and delete anything they'd already filmed. Nobody explained why. Selen looked up at the jets crossing overhead and felt an ache tighten in her chest for no reason she could name. Mia noticed her go pale and asked if she was all right. Selen brushed it off, telling her it was nothing, though her eyes stayed fixed on the sky long after the jets had disappeared. Neither of them had any way of knowing that somewhere inside that heavily guarded transport plane lay the boy she had spent 3 years mourning, unconscious and completely exhausted, being carried to intensive care by the full weight of the country's medical and military apparatus. At the hospital, panic briefly swept through the highest levels of command until doctors confirmed the diagnosis: nothing supernatural, nothing sinister, just total physical exhaustion from days without proper rest. Ashton had pushed his body past every reasonable limit, chasing a breakthrough that would have taken other teams years to achieve, and his body had simply refused to go any further. For 3 days, Selen had no idea why her messages went unanswered. She sent good morning texts that got no reply, then good night messages that vanished into silence, then increasingly frustrated warnings that she was done waiting, giving him 30 minutes, then none at all. Each unanswered message chipped away at the fragile trust she'd only just begun rebuilding. By the second day, worry had curdled into something closer to old wounds reopening, the same helpless feeling from 3 years earlier. Except this time, she had proof he was alive, and it still felt like losing him all over again. On the 3rd day, Ashton's fingers twitched against the hospital sheets before his eyes finally opened. Director Wallace and President Morrison, head of the National Academy of Sciences, were both seated nearby, and the moment they noticed him stir, Wallace practically leapt off the couch, shouting for a doctor. Ashton, still groggy, asked only for his phone and how many days he'd lost. 3 days, Wallace told him. Ashton unlocked the screen and felt his stomach drop. Message after message from Selen filled the display, starting worried and ending furious, then trailing off into silence entirely partway through the 2nd day, as if she'd simply given up expecting a reply. Buried among them was a message from a roommate warning him that the sophomore student council vice president planned to confess to Selen at the upcoming freshman welcome gala and asking if Ashton would be back in time. He scrolled to the class group chat and confirmed it. The gala was that same night. He asked the doctor if he could be discharged immediately. Both Wallace and Morrison objected at once, telling him his body needed real rest, offering instead to send a car so he could attend from a wheelchair if it mattered that much to him. Ashton refused both options. He promised the doctor his body would hold up for half a day if it had to, then asked for the gala's schedule down to the minute, calculating travel time between the ceremony he was technically obligated to attend and the campus event he actually needed to reach. When Wallace asked, half in disbelief, why it had to be tonight specifically, Ashton answered simply that someone was about to take something of his, and he didn't intend to let that happen without a fight. He arrived at the auditorium with barely 30 minutes to spare, sprinting the last stretch on legs that were still not fully steady. A student volunteer at the door stopped him, since he'd left his admission pass behind, but a photo of his student ID and a quick comparison of his face were enough to wave him through. He learned backstage that the girl originally scheduled to perform piano for his class had fallen ill, and the class group chat was scrambling for a replacement. Ashton volunteered immediately, though none of his roommates had ever heard him mention playing an instrument in his life. He asked to change the piece to something specific, a song called Maiden's Prayer, a piece about a young woman's quiet longing for something beautiful. The senior overseeing the program recognized the choice and asked, with some amusement, if he was playing it for a girlfriend. A roommate answered before Ashton could, insisting he'd never so much as held a girl's hand in his life, though the truth was closer to something else entirely. Ashton had once promised to play that exact piece for Selen at a high school talent show, a promise he never got the chance to keep before he vanished. Backstage, Selen read the updated program card and froze the instant she saw his name printed beside the piece. Her voice wavered slightly as she introduced the next act to the crowd, announcing a Class 1 performer, and by the time the words left her mouth, her composure had already cracked at the edges. Ashton climbed onto the stage, gave a small bow, and sat at the piano beneath a spotlight that put every detail of his face on the massive screen behind him. Somewhere in the audience, girls whispered excitedly, and his roommates exchanged a look, quietly amused at how little their friends seemed to notice the reaction he caused. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked once at Selen, standing motionless at the edge of the stage, before turning to the keys. The melody that followed was slow and unhurried, carrying more weight than any explanation he could have given her backstage. When the final note faded, he stood, bowed to the audience, and let his gaze rest on Selen one more time before walking off. She composed herself just long enough to introduce the next act with Kevin at her side, then quietly told him she needed a moment and slipped away. She found Ashton in the hallway outside the green room and grabbed his hand before he even saw her coming, pulling him aside without a word of explanation. The instant the door closed behind them, her composure broke completely. She asked if he thought this was some kind of game, vanishing without warning and then reappearing to perform music like nothing had happened. She admitted, voice shaking, that she had liked him back in high school, that she'd been happy the moment she learned he was alive, and that none of that gave him the right to put her through 3 more days of silence with no explanation at all. Ashton tried to apologize, but the words caught, because he couldn't tell her the real reason without breaking the classified boundaries drawn around every part of his life. His silence, meant as protection, only confirmed her worst fear, that he had nothing real to offer her. Selen told him she was done asking why. She said she didn't care anymore where he went or what he did, that from this point on, his life had nothing to do with hers, and that pretending they'd never known each other would be easier than living in fear of him disappearing again. She walked past him without another glance, pushed open the door, and returned to her seat beside Kevin as if nothing had happened. Only once she was far enough away did a single tear slip down her cheek, quickly wiped before anyone could notice. Her cold exit had been a performance of its own, the last piece of composure she had left to give. Ashton watched her go and said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't put people he cared about at risk. Back in his seat, his roommates immediately swarmed him with questions, certain he must have confessed backstage and been shot down. Ashton corrected them only enough to say she was upset about his silence over the past few days, without offering the reason why. One of them, only half joking, told him that 3 days without a reply online was practically an automatic breakup, and that he'd earned every bit of her anger. Another pointed out, more usefully, that as long as she still cared enough to be furious with him, the door wasn't fully closed. The day she stopped being angry, he was told, was the day to actually start worrying. That warning turned out to matter sooner than anyone expected. As the gala wound toward its close, the spotlight swung unexpectedly onto Kevin, and a student rushed forward with a bouquet of roses. The room, already restless with students preparing to leave, sat back down at once. Kevin took the microphone and addressed the entire auditorium, telling Selen he had admired her since the day they met freshman year, that he had spent a full year working up the courage to say so, and that he was asking her, in front of everyone, for a real chance to be with her. Silence swallowed the room. Every eye turned to Selen. She didn't hesitate long. She told Kevin plainly that accepting his feelings wasn't something she could fake, that liking someone had to be real for her to say yes, and that she simply didn't feel that way about him. She reminded him she had already made her answer clear once before and told him there would be no second chance to ask again. Then she took the microphone from his hands, turned, and walked off stage without looking back. Ashton, watching from the crowd, let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Whatever ground he'd lost backstage, at least Kevin hadn't gained any either. He gathered himself, reminded his friends they still had a karaoke outing planned that night, and forced his exhausted body to keep moving. Love and everything he was trying to rebuild with Selen would have to wait a little longer, but he had no intention of giving up on either. Walking back to the dorm that night, Mia couldn't resist bringing up what everyone had watched unfold on stage. She teased Selen about how coldly she'd rejected Kevin, joking that the poor boy had been shot down twice now in front of the entire school. Selen shrugged it off, saying if he'd had the nerve to confess publicly, he should have been ready to be turned down publicly too. Then, trying to change the subject before Ashton came up again, Mia pulled out her phone and showed her a trending headline instead. The National Academy of Sciences had just announced a breakthrough, a lithography machine precise to 1 nanometer and China's first domestically made chip. Selen barely glanced at it, her mood too low to care about national news. Then something in the accompanying photo caught her eye, and she snatched the phone back for a closer look. The image showed a row of scientists at the press conference, and near the front, at the very end of the line, stood a young man photographed only from behind. The build, the posture, the way his shoulders sat, all of it looked exactly like Ashton. She told herself it had to be a coincidence. Whoever attended a press conference at that level would need credentials most people twice his age never earned. But she couldn't shake the shape of that silhouette. She remembered, almost as an afterthought, a small metal pin she'd noticed on his jacket earlier that night, one she hadn't thought twice about at the time. Back in her dorm, she pulled up the photo again, zoomed in, and searched online for medals that matched it, finding nothing close enough to be certain. Eventually, she talked herself out of the idea entirely, deciding it was foolish to hope her ordinary freshman classmate had secretly been standing in a room full of the country's top scientists. She had no way of knowing just how right her instincts actually were. A week passed in an uneasy quiet between them, until an unrelated disaster brought them back together. Late one night, out celebrating the end of military training at a karaoke bar downtown, Ashton stepped away from his friends to find a restroom and instead walked straight into a police raid targeting an entirely different group in the building. Officers swept through the hallway, grabbing everyone who fit a rough description, Ashton included, despite his protests that he had nothing to do with whatever they were investigating. He was herded into a room with several others, and when an officer offered to let him go if a friend could come confirm his story, Ashton realized he didn't actually remember his own room number to call anyone for verification. 2 undercover national security agents assigned to protect him quietly stepped in and vouched for his identity, technically clearing him on the spot. Ashton, given the chance to leave immediately, chose not to. Instead, he asked the lead officer if he could stay and have someone specific come collect him once he was formally cleared. Sitting in the waiting area with 40 minutes left before campus curfew, he pulled out his phone and texted Selen directly, telling her he'd been arrested and needed someone to bail him out. Selen's first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by concern she tried and failed to hide. When he explained his roommates weren't answering their phones, she agreed, against her better judgment, to come get him herself. She arrived at the station half an hour later, marching straight up to him with her arms crossed, demanding to know if he'd lost his mind, reminding him she'd made it clear they were supposed to be nothing to each other anymore. Ashton, sitting there deliberately looking as pitiful as he could manage, told her that even a night in a holding cell would have been better than her never wanting to see him again. Selen's anger faltered slightly at that, though she covered it by threatening, half seriously, to slap him hard enough to bankrupt his health insurance. Outside the station, his stomach growled loudly enough to break the tension entirely. Selen, despite herself, agreed to grab food with him, and they ended up at a small barbecue stall on a street corner, eating in careful, testing silence before real conversation finally returned. She asked him, point blank, to explain where he'd gone for those 3 years, and why he vanished the way he did. Ashton gave her the only version of the truth he was allowed to share, that something urgent had happened at home, and he'd been unable to explain it at the time, and that his phone had genuinely broken during the days he went silent before the gala. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough for her to accept, at least for tonight. She told him she believed him, and something in her posture eased for the first time since he'd come back into her life. By the time they finished eating, it was well past midnight, and the dormitories were already locked for curfew. Neither of them had anywhere to go. They ended up at a small hotel nearby, where the front desk clerk, noticing their joined hands, informed them the only room left was a deluxe suite with a single king-size bed. Selen negotiated terms on the spot, declaring Ashton would take the sofa while she kept the bed, and he agreed without argument. When they opened the door and found rose petals arranged across the mattress by mistake, Selen's face went red instantly, and she bolted for the bathroom to splash cold water on her cheeks, while Ashton quietly swept the petals into the trash. Later, lying in the dark, with the lights off, and Ashton stretched out on the sofa, faint noises from the room above made both of them go rigid with embarrassment before finally fading away. After a long stretch of silence, Selen's voice came softly through the dark, asking if he was still awake, then telling him he could come sleep on the bed, so long as an invisible line down the middle stayed uncrossed. Ashton didn't need to be told twice. They lay there quietly for a while before Selen began describing, almost dreamily, the kind of future she imagined for them. A small home with a sofa they'd picked out together, a balcony lined with plants they'd grown themselves, the smell of soup she'd make simmering on the stove while he walked through the door each evening. She asked if he thought a life like that could ever really be theirs. Ashton told her yes, that he could see them growing old together, still arguing playfully well into their 80s. She laughed at that, teasing that if he ever tried starting a fight with her at 81, she'd win it, just the same as she always had. That night, for once, Ashton didn't retreat into the eternal knowledge vault buried inside his mind to study, the way he had almost every other night since arriving on campus. He let himself simply lie beside her and rest. It didn't last peacefully. Sometime before dawn, cold sweat broke across his forehead, his jaw tightened, and a strangled sound escaped him before he bolted upright, breathing hard, staring at the pale light creeping over the horizon outside the window. Selen woke instantly, alarmed, and pulled herself close to listen to his racing heartbeat, asking gently if he'd had a nightmare. He told her yes, and nothing more. She held him until his pulse slowed, promising softly that she was right there, and that he could go back to sleep. He did, eventually, though whatever had shaken him in that dream stayed lodged somewhere deep in his thoughts long after the sun came up, a warning his conscious mind hadn't fully deciphered yet. Morning came late for both of them. When Selen finally stirred, sunlight was already spilling across the blankets and Ashton lay sprawled half across her, still asleep. She woke him with a sharp slap the instant she registered the time, horrified to realize it was nearly noon, and Mia had been calling non-stop. They dressed in a rush, Ashton borrowing a mask to cover the very visible handprint still glowing on his cheek, a detail Selen found far funnier than she should have, as they hurried back toward campus together. Once life settled back into its normal rhythm, Ashton wasted no time putting down roots of a very different kind. Within days, military transport trucks rolled onto campus, unloading crate after crate of precision equipment into a building that had sat mostly empty. Students who wandered past could only guess what kind of research required that level of security. Inside, Ashton stood among rows of instruments that most working scientists would never see in their entire careers, and quietly began building a laboratory suited to the kind of work he could never fully explain to anyone around him. Selen had her own quiet victory that same week. While reviewing the stock market from her dorm room, one of her few open indulgences and a skill sharp enough that she'd already turned a modest sum of family savings into a striking profit within her first year of college, an email arrived that made her freeze. A renowned finance professor, one of the few authorities in the country on economic policy, was offering to admit her directly into his combined master's and doctoral program, skipping the entrance exam most students spent years preparing for. She screamed loud enough that Mia came running, certain something was wrong, only to find her roommate grinning ear to ear over her laptop screen. That evening, Selen treated her whole group of friends to lunch, proud of an achievement that was entirely her own, earned without anyone's help or hidden advantage. The peace didn't last long. Late one night, Ashton's phone rang with a call from President Morrison, something that almost never happened after 9 in the evening. Morrison's voice carried none of its usual warmth, only urgency, asking how many sets of Ashton's nano-battle armor were currently operational. Within half an hour, a military helicopter was waiting to take him to a command center, no explanation given beyond the order to bring every set of armor he had. At the base, Commander Yang led him straight to a bank of screens, without wasting time on greetings. The footage playing showed dense jungle terrain near the national border, and at the center of the frame stood creatures that made Ashton's expression go cold instantly. They looked like dogs, but larger, encased in something like natural armor plating, jaws dripping a corrosive drool that hissed and smoked wherever it touched the ground. Commander Yang explained that a border patrol unit had stumbled onto them less than an hour earlier, and that conventional weapons had done nothing. An entire Special Forces squad had already been lost, trying to hold the line. Ashton studied the footage in silence, his mind already working faster than the numbers scrolling past on the monitors. This wasn't ordinary mutation. Something had deliberately altered these creatures at a genetic level, splicing in material that had no business existing in any natural animal. He asked what was needed of him. Commander Yang told him soldiers were still fighting for their lives in that jungle right now, and that if the creatures broke through to any populated area, the damage would be catastrophic. The plan was to fly the nano-armor directly to the soldiers on the ground and let Ashton remotely operate the suits from the command center, bonding the technology to men who had never trained with it before. Ashton agreed without hesitation, adding only one request of his own. Once the threat was contained, he wanted an intact specimen brought back, so he could study its genetic sequence firsthand. Something about those creatures told him this was only the surface of a much larger problem, one that even the vast knowledge buried in his mind hadn't fully prepared him to understand yet. He spent the rest of that night piloting armor he'd never tested in real combat, guiding untrained soldiers through movements he calculated in real time as the fighting raged on distant screens in front of him. By the time the last hound went still, the sky over the base was starting to lighten. He left the command center just after 1 in the morning, too drained to make the trip back to campus, and checked into a hotel near the university instead, rather than intrude on the base's guest quarters at that hour. Alone in the room, he found a goodnight message from Selen sent over an hour earlier, and replied briefly before lying back to think. On the surface, what he'd just witnessed looked like an isolated case of illegal genetic tampering, the kind criminal syndicates occasionally attempted for profit or spectacle. But something in the structure of those altered genes felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary science, and everything inside him that had learned to trust his instincts over the past 3 years refused to let the feeling go. His phone buzzed again before he could fall asleep. Selen, still awake, asked if something had happened, her tone gentle but knowing, the kind of instinct only someone who paid close attention could have. Ashton, steadying his hands before he answered, told her only that he hadn't been able to sleep either. She offered, without being asked, to come find him if something was bothering him, insisting he shouldn't carry it alone. When he pointed out the dorm curfew, she laughed quietly, telling him no curfew in the world could stop her from checking on him if she decided to. True to her word, she climbed out through an unlocked lobby window with Mia's help less than an hour later, nearly getting caught by the dorm warden along the way, and arrived at his hotel room well after midnight. She found him distracted and heavier in spirit than she'd ever seen him, and though he couldn't tell her what had happened at the border, she didn't press. She simply pulled him close, let him rest his head against her, and stayed with him until the night's tension finally eased into something calmer. It was, without either of them saying so directly, the clearest sign yet that whatever secret weight Ashton carried, she intended to stand beside him through it, even without knowing what it was. The next morning, Selen woke up early and unusually excited, picking out an outfit with more care than she normally bothered with. She and Ashton had planned their first real outing together as something other than two people untangling old wounds, a simple trip to an amusement park, the kind of ordinary date neither of them had ever gotten the chance to have back in high school. Mia teased her mercilessly while she got ready, joking that she was dressed to make her boyfriend forget his own name. Ashton, meanwhile, was staring at his phone with a different kind of tension building in his chest. President Morrison was calling again, and this time the news was harder to shake off. The military's analysis of the genetic material recovered from the mutant hounds had come back, and the results were unlike anything researchers had ever classified before. The code didn't match any known species, natural or engineered. Morrison asked when Ashton could come examine the findings himself, calling it a discovery that might only make sense to him. Ashton hesitated longer than he meant to. He admitted he wanted to stay on campus a little while longer, and when Morrison asked if something was wrong, he confessed something quieter than he usually allowed himself to say out loud. He wasn't sure he was ready to face whatever this new mystery might demand of him. 3 years earlier, he'd walked into a classified lab without a second thought, ready to give everything he had for his country. Now, for the first time, some small selfish part of him wanted to hold on to an ordinary life a little longer, to graduate, to date Selen properly, to let someone else carry the next impossible problem for a while. Morrison, to his credit, didn't push. He told Ashton to rest, and reminded him gently that what he'd already accomplished had secured his place in the history of science, regardless of what came next. But after the call ended, the smile Ashton had been wearing all morning faded on its own. Selen met him outside her dorm a few minutes later, beaming, but the moment she looked at him, her excitement dimmed slightly. She'd learned to read the difference between his ordinary tiredness and this particular kind of heaviness, the one that had settled over him since the night at the hotel. She asked if it was the academy calling again. He nodded slowly, admitting it was serious, more serious than anything he'd dealt with before, something that could shake far more than just his own life if it went wrong. She didn't ask for details he couldn't give her. Instead, she rose onto her toes and kissed his cheek, then stepped back and told him to go, that the amusement park could wait for another day. She reminded him she didn't fully understand what he was working on, but she'd already seen enough to know he wasn't the type of person who could ignore a responsibility like that, even if it cost him something he wanted for himself. She told him, with more certainty than either of them expected, that he wasn't hers alone to keep, that whatever gift he carried belonged to more people than just her, but that her heart still only had room for one person in it. Something in Ashton steadied at those words. Whatever fear had been circling in his chest since the phone call quieted enough for him to remember exactly why he'd chosen this fight in the first place. Within the hour, a helicopter lifted off from beside his campus lab, carrying him back to the classified aerospace facility. Selen sat alone on the grass field below, watching it shrink into the sky until it disappeared completely. She allowed herself one small, quiet smile once it was gone, telling herself that whatever version of him just left to face down the unknown was the truest version of who he really was, and that she'd rather share her life with that man than with someone content to hide from the world's harder problems. At the research facility, the mood had shifted entirely from routine science into something closer to a slow-burning crisis. Deep underground, inside a massive ring-shaped test chamber, engineers had finished the next stage of the Drive Force Propulsion Project, a verification craft called Cosmos 1, suspended within a distortion field that visibly bent the light around it. Ashton stood at the main control console while Wallace, Morrison, Professor Grant, and a room full of senior officials watched the readouts in tense silence. When the command to initiate the primary thrust test finally came through, the shuttle-shaped craft didn't move under its own power at all. Instead, the fabric of space itself seemed to carry it forward, defying the ordinary rules of acceleration entirely. Every gauge in the room climbed steadily upward, confirming what months of grueling work had promised. It was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest breakthroughs in the history of propulsion science, and everyone in that chamber understood exactly what they were witnessing. Ashton allowed himself a small measure of relief at the sight, though something behind his eyes stayed guarded, aware that this triumph had opened a door to a much larger problem waiting on the other side. That night, while his team celebrated, a heavily encrypted briefing landed on his desk, warning that the situation surrounding the border creatures had grown far more complicated than anyone initially believed. Clear signs pointed toward interference that had nothing to do with ordinary human science. Ashton read the report twice, then set it aside, and turned to the one resource capable of making sense of it, the vast, still only partially understood knowledge buried inside his own mind. Over the following nights, his time split cleanly in two. By day, he refined propulsion theory and planned the next round of experiments alongside Wallace and his team. By night, he descended into the depths of the eternal knowledge vault, searching for anything connected to the strange genetic pattern recovered from the hounds. Selen, sensing the exhaustion behind his brief video calls, never pried into what he couldn't explain. Instead, she mailed him snacks from their hometown and filled their calls with funny stories from campus, small anchors of normal life he badly needed. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived in an obscure and nearly forgotten corner of the vault. Buried among records left behind by a long-extinct civilization, Ashton found references to something called the primordial code, described as a fundamental unit of information woven into the structure of the universe itself. Certain fragments of the mutant hound's genetic sequence matched that ancient code with a precision too exact to be coincidence, as though some degraded piece of it had been deliberately spliced into a living creature. He brought the discovery straight to Wallace and the highest levels of command, warning them plainly that if whatever force controlled this power was left unchecked, it could destabilize the laws of physics across an entire region, or worse. The decision that followed came fast and quiet, the kind made in rooms with no windows. Ashton was authorized to deploy the Cosmos Project's most advanced technology, working alongside intelligence operatives, to locate the source of the genetic anomaly and, if necessary, destroy it before it could do any further damage. Back at Jingdu University, finals were closing in, and Selen buried herself in the library late into the night, preparing for an important exam. When she finally packed up to leave, exhausted and rubbing her eyes, she noticed a missed call and a single message from Ashton's encrypted number. It read simply that he needed her to come home. She tried calling back immediately, but the line refused to connect. Something in her chest tightened with a fear she hadn't felt since the days when she believed him dead, and she ran back to her dorm, opening every news source she could find, searching for any explanation at all. Mainstream headlines stayed calm and ordinary. But scattered across obscure tech forums, she found fragments of strange reports, unexplained geological activity in a remote region, brief but powerful bursts of electromagnetic interference, and scattered eyewitness accounts of twisted bands of light bending across the night sky. At the northern frontier base, tension had stretched thin enough to feel physical. Ashton stood in the cockpit of an upgraded Cosmos 1, sealed into a flight suit built specifically for this mission, while Wallace's voice came through the communicator, carrying more worry than his usual composed tone ever allowed. He told Ashton to be careful, to focus on gathering data, that safety mattered more than the mission itself. Ashton promised, simply, that he'd deliver what needed delivering, right on schedule. The engine activated once more, and Cosmos 1 slid silently into warped space, accelerating toward a target hundreds of miles away, where sensors had detected an unusually intense biological energy field twisting the space around it. Whatever waited there was attempting to force open something the report only described as a stable microscopic tear in space itself, A small device detached from the craft as Ashton closed the distance, dropping toward the mass below and releasing a concentrated pulse of directed energy the instant it made contact. Whatever the pulse struck let out a shriek with no real sound to it, a violent shudder that rippled through the warped space around it, like disturbed water. Then the situation turned dangerous in an instant. A sickly green beam of energy lanced out from the creature, and despite every evasive maneuver Ashton attempted, it clipped the edge of his craft. Alarms tore through the cockpit at once, shields compromised, power failing on one side, the field keeping his ship stable growing unpredictable by the second. Then came something far worse than mechanical failure. A wave of ice-cold pressure slammed directly into his mind, a psychic assault carrying nothing but raw, destructive intent, trying to force its way past every wall of thought he had. The vault buried deep inside him responded on its own, an invisible barrier snapping into place around the edges of his consciousness before the assault could take hold completely. Even blocked, the impact left him dizzy, his vision swimming as he fought to keep his focus on the controls in front of him. This was the moment the opening of this story had already shown, the danger that started this telling before circling back to explain how a heartbroken teenager had become the man now fighting for his life above a hostile jungle. Everything that had come before, the disappearance, the reunion, the quiet nights spent studying an ancient vault of knowledge, had built toward exactly this instant. Ashton gathered what strength he had left. There was no room left for caution now. He funneled almost every remaining bit of power from Cosmos 1 straight into the drive force engine, generating a localized distortion far more powerful than anything the craft had produced before, something closer to an invisible hand pressing down with enough weight to crush whatever lay beneath it. There was no explosion, no burst of fire the way ordinary weapons might have produced. Instead came a low, muffled roar, the deep sound of space itself being forcibly compressed and flattened. The pale glow beneath him vanished, the warped field collapsed. The monstrous shape that had nearly ended him disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a stretch of scoured earth, scraped clean as though some enormous force had passed a single hand across it. For a long moment, Ashton simply sat in the silence that followed, breathing hard, waiting for his instruments to confirm what his body already told him. The threat was gone. 1 week later, the campus had returned to its ordinary rhythm, though Ashton's face still carried a faint paleness that hadn't fully faded. He and Selen sat together on a bench beside Wying Lake, the last light of the day turning the water gold. She leaned into his shoulder and held his hand, telling him quietly that all that mattered was that he'd come back. He reminded her, with a small smile, that he'd promised not to disappear on her without reason again, and he intended to keep that promise for good. Selen lifted her head and looked at him steadily, telling him she understood he was involved in something important, maybe even something dangerous, even if she couldn't fully grasp what it was. She asked him only to remember one thing. No matter how far he had to go, this place, and she herself, would always be waiting for him to come home to. She admitted she might never be able to stand beside him in whatever fight he was facing, but she could still be the light he returned to when it was over. Ashton held her hand tighter and looked out over the water, telling her honestly that the world was larger and more dangerous than either of them had ever imagined growing up, full of both light and depths no one had fully charted yet. He told her the path ahead of him would likely stay full of unknowns for a long time to come, but having someone worth protecting, someone as remarkable as her, gave him the courage to keep walking into that darkness instead of turning away from it. He turned to face her fully then, and told her that once everything settled, he intended to take her somewhere to see real fireworks, not the ones from their hometown island they used to watch as teenagers, but something far beyond that, a view of the whole curve of the earth, spread out beneath a sky full of light. Selen's eyes went wide with surprise, then softened into something closer to wonder, tears she hadn't expected gathering at the edges. She nodded and told him simply that she'd wait, for however long it took. Night settled gently over the campus as they sat there together, the streetlights flickering on one by one along the path behind them. Neither of them said much more. They didn't need to. A boy who once vanished from a girl's life without explanation had found his way back, carrying secrets he still couldn't share, standing at the edge of a much bigger story than either of them had ever imagined possible. Somewhere far beyond the reach of ordinary science, an ancient code still waited to be understood, and whatever force had planted its fragments into a living creature on Earth's own border had not yet shown its full hand. But for one quiet evening beside the water, none of that mattered as much as two people finally choosing, after everything, to stay. Their story, and the far greater one now unfolding around them, had only just begun.